The winter sky sagged low over the eastern front, a heavy slab of iron-colored clouds pressing down on the frozen fields, where fear and survival mingled in every breath. Within this vast and brutal canvas moved a young woman whose name soldiers often forgot to speak, replacing it instead with murmurs and crude jokes about her crooked stance and her uneven aim, as if war itself had spared a corner for mockery. She carried her rifle not with elegance, but with a stubborn intimacy, the strap cutting into her shoulder, as if reminding her that nothing in this conflict would ever align perfect. When she walked across the training yard, the men turned their heads just enough to share their smirk, their eyes following the slight tilt of her weapon, as if gravity itself conspired to make her absurd. Yet beneath her wool cap and frost-stung cheeks lived a quiet resolve, a small ember that once sparked refused to die, and when she lay prone in the snow, adjusting her imperfect angle toward distant silhouettes, she felt something shift inside her, something that did not belong to those who laughed. The instructors barely noticed her, dismissing her as another volunteer driven by grief or patriotism or desperation. And the war had a way of swallowing such women whole before anyone learned their names. But she learned quickly that anonymity could be a weapon, a space where a person could grow unseen, away from expectation. Day after day, she practiced with a patience that bordered on ritual, her breath slow, her finger steady, her gaze narrowing with a strange tenderness toward the faraway world she sought to understand. She missed often, and even when she hit the target, it was not quite where she intended, the bullet landing slightly left or slightly low, making the men snort and whisper that she was cursed with a lopsided fate. Yet she felt no shame. Each failure whispered something to her, taught her the rhythm of wind and the tremor of her own pulse, and she began to weave these imperfections into a method that was hers alone, a method so subtle she barely understood it herself. When the first snowstorm swallowed the camp in its roaring white silence, she ventured out to the firing line earlier than the others, sinking into the drifts as if they might cradle her doubts. The trees stood like silent witnesses, their branches burdened by the weight of the season, and as she nestled into the cold earth, she felt her heartbeat settle into an ancient, steady thrum. She waited for the wind to steady, watching the distant wooden silhouette blur and reform as currents of icy air moved like ghosts across the field. She fired only once that morning, a slow, deliberate shot that cracked the stillness. This time the bullet struck the target dead center, not through perfection, but through the strange geometry she had begun to trust. She rose quietly, brushed the snow from her uniform, and returned before anyone noticed she had gone. Word of her improvement spread not because she boasted, but because war magnified every shift, every anomaly. Men who had once joked now watched her in careful silence, unsure whether to revise their judgments or simply wait for her to stumble again. But she did not stumble. With each passing day, she grew into her own shape, embracing the crookedness of her stance, the slight misalignment of her weapon, the asymmetry that had once been her shame. She realized that precision did not always emerge from symmetry, but could blossom from understanding the peculiarities of one's own body and the unpredictable dance of weather, terrain, and instinct. She began to feel the battlefield before she saw it, listening for the faintest rustle of movement, noticing the way light bent in the cold morning haze, sensing the trembling urgency in the air. When she was finally deployed, the front greeted her not with ceremony, but with an abrupt plunge into chaos, the kind of chaos that erases rank and reputation. The trenches breathed fear, the smell of gunpowder mingling with frozen soil, and the sky glowed with the eerie pulse of distant artillery. She settled into her position, the frost biting her fingertips, her breath forming small clouds that dissolved quickly into the wind. Her first opportunity came at dawn, when a German scout moved silently across the tree line. The shot she fired was not perfect, nor was it meant to be. It curved slightly, as all her shots did, guided by her strange, instinctive corrections. The man fell instantly. No laughter followed, only the quiet acknowledgement of soldiers who understood survival when they saw it. In those early days, she felt herself transform from an object of mockery into a presence that altered the air around her, not through pride, which she had little use for, but through a deepening awareness of what her skill meant in a world collapsing. She did not think of numbers yet, nor of what history might one day carve into stone. She thought only of the faces around her, the fragile humanity clinging to life in the cold, and the certainty that every shot she took carried the weight of someone else's tomorrow. The war would reveal much more in the months ahead, testing the boundaries of her endurance and the limits of her heart. But within the first stretch of those bitter days, she understood one truth with clarity. Sometimes the world underestimates those who learn to embrace their own imperfections, and in doing so, the world makes room for miracles carved from the crooked lines of survival. The front lines shifted like a wounded animal, crawling back and forth across the frozen wilderness, as armies clashed with the stubbornness of those who feared not defeat, but the emptiness that followed it. She moved within that shifting landscape with a growing steadiness, her presence no longer a curiosity, but a quiet reassurance that somewhere among the mud and ruins lived a soul who had learned to breathe through the chaos. Her squad, once indifferent to her, now watched her with a reverence that was never spoken aloud, because in war, reverence felt too fragile, too sacred to voice. They learned to listen for the soft thud of her boots approaching through the frost, because whenever she arrived, a strange calm seemed to descend, as if the very trees recognized her and held their breath. She did not seek the role of protector, yet it clung to her as naturally as frost clings to a dying leaf. Her first string of confirmed kills came quietly, almost without her noticing the tally accumulating in the whispers around the fire, where exhausted soldiers warmed their hands and tried not to think of the faces behind the rifles aimed at them from the other side. She did not celebrate these moments. Instead, she felt them settle inside her like stones dropped into deep water, each ripple sending a tremor through her chest. She had learned to see the enemy not as monstrous figures, but as human shapes caught in the machinery of something far larger than any of them understood. Still, she did her duty because duty was the thread that kept the fragile fabric of her unit from tearing apart. She lay for hours in the snow, her body stiffening, her breath controlled until it became as faint as the shifting wind. She waited for movement, for shadows out of place, for the soft crunch of boots where no boots should be. And when she fired, the bullet always drifted the slightest bit off-center, a quiet signature of the imperfection that had become her strength. Her commanders took notice long before she realized they were watching. Reports filtered upward, passing from trench to office to headquarters, until her name began appearing in briefings inked with cautious admiration. But admiration in wartime was a trembling, easily shattered by a single misstep, and so she guarded her growing reputation with humility, refusing to let the weight of expectations distort the simplicity of her mission. She rose before dawn each day, her breath forming pale halos in the frigid air, and she trained until her muscles burned and her fingers numbed. She studied the terrain with almost devotional intensity, tracing patterns in the snow and memorizing the contours of hills and shattered farmhouses. She had come to understand that the battlefield was a living creature, and those who learned to read its moods survived longer than those who relied on brute force. The soldiers who once mocked her now approached her with hesitant questions, asking how she compensated for the tilt in her aim, how she read the direction of the wind by the way frost formed on the branches, how she steadied her heart when the world around her pulsed with fear. She answered them softly, without pride or annoyance, sharing her methods as if they were simple truths, rather than the intimate fragments of a craft she had built through loneliness and persistence. Some tried to imitate her techniques, bending their elbows just so or tilting their rifles slightly off-center, but none could replicate the instinct she carried within her, an instinct that felt as though it had been waiting inside her long before she ever touched a weapon. As January deepened into a brutal, unforgiving cold, the war pressed harder against their lines. German patrols grew bolder, slipping through the forests with a silent menace that kept every soldier awake through the long nights. Her squad suffered losses that carved hollow spaces into their morale, and grief became a familiar companion, drifting among them like smoke. Yet in these darkest moments, she seemed to grow even more determined, as if each life taken from her unit sharpened her understanding of why she fought. She watched over her comrades with a quiet tenderness, offering not comfort, but presence, the kind of presence that steadied trembling hands and reminded them they were not alone. It was during one of these bleak nights, when the temperature plummeted to a cruel depth and the world felt suspended in a frozen breath, that she achieved the string of kills that solidified her legend. A German unit advanced under the cover of darkness, their silhouettes blending with the trees, their rifles gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She sensed them before she saw them, a subtle disturbance in the stillness, a shift in the air that only someone who had become part of the landscape itself could detect. She positioned herself with deliberate slowness, the cold seeping into her bones, and she waited for the exact moment when their formation spread. One shot, then another, each fired with the strange, lopsided geometry she trusted, each finding its mark with uncanny precision. Her squad watched in awe as the attack faltered, confusion rippling through the enemy ranks. They never saw her as she moved through the snow like a whisper, her breath steady, her heart calm. By dawn, word had spread that she alone had stopped the advance. buying her unit precious time to regroup and fortify their position. She did not feel triumphant. Instead, she felt the familiar heaviness settle inside her once more, the quiet knowledge that survival demanded sacrifices from both sides. But her comrades saw in her something they could cling to, something that reminded them that even in the bleakest winter, unexpected strength could rise from the most unlikely places. The war deepened into a grinding, merciless rhythm that devoured days and nights indiscriminately, turning time into something brittle and indistinct, a thin layer of frost that cracked beneath the weight of every footstep. She moved through this slow dissolution of hours with a quiet endurance that astonished even those who had come to rely on her. The front had become a labyrinth of collapsed farmhouses, frozen marshland, and skeletal trees that clawed at the sky like the fingers of those who never made it home. In this ravaged landscape, she felt the strange duality of being both hunter and guardian, a shadow drifting beside her comrade, absorbing their fears, anchoring their desperation. Her rifle had become less a weapon and more an extension of her own breath, something fused to her spirit through necessity, grief, and a purpose that had grown far larger than the girl she once was. By the third week of February, her tally had reached numbers she refused to acknowledge, though the reports circulated among the officers with growing urgency. They watched her from afar the way one watches a natural phenomenon, uncertain whether they were witnessing luck, divine intervention, or a mind sharpened to an edge no one else could bear to touch. Yet she did not feel extraordinary. She felt tired, hollow, and human. Each shot she took left an imprint on her, a quiet bruise in the soul that no one could see. The men she felled occupied her dreams, not as enemies, but as fleeting silhouettes dissolving into the snow, and she woke each morning with the weight of those phantoms pressing into her ribs. Still, she rose, because to stop would be to surrender her comrades to the very fate she fought to spare them from. The battlefield had developed its own personality, a brooding presence that shifted with the wind and whispered secrets through the creaking branches. She learned to read these whispers with an almost supernatural sensitivity, noticing the subtle tremors in the ground before an artillery assault, the sudden stillness in the forest that signaled an approaching patrol, the metallic scent of gun oil carried by a breeze from an unseen ridge. Her comrades sometimes glanced at her with awe and unease, as if she had become something more attuned to the war than to the world that had existed before it. She could not explain how she sensed these things. They emerged from the quiet space inside her, where instinct and sorrow intertwined, forming something sharp enough to pierce the fog of battle. It was during one particularly brutal stretch, when the front lines dissolved into close-quarter skirmishes across ice-coated fields, that she entered a phase of near-constant engagement. German units pressed relentlessly, emboldened by reinforcements and the hope of breaking the cycle of stalemate. Her squad was exhausted, their uniforms stiff with frozen mud, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. But she stood among them like a small, unwavering flame. She positioned herself on a ridge overlooking a narrow pass, frequently used by enemy scouts, her body buried beneath layers of snow and camouflage until she resembled a patch of the earth itself. For hours, she lay motionless, her breath a faint rhythm beneath the wind, waiting for the movement she knew would come. When the German patrol finally appeared, 5 silhouettes moving quickly and confidently through the drifts, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. She exhaled slowly, letting her imperfect aim find its balance in the subtle dip of her shoulder, the slight lean of her body into the earth. One by one, the patrol fell, each shot a whisper swallowed by the snow. Her squad, hidden behind ruined stone walls, watched in stunned silence as she dismantled the threat before it reached their position. They would later claim she saved their lives that day, though she refused to accept their gratitude. To her, it was simply another thread in the tapestry of survival they were all struggling to weave. Her reputation grew in the surrounding units, whispered through trenches, and passed along with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Some doubted the numbers attributed to her, assuming exaggeration born of desperation, but those who had fought beside her knew the truth. She was not a myth. She was a young woman sculpted by harsh necessity, someone who had learned to channel her fear into fierce precision. Her commanders summoned her for briefings more frequently now, asking her to assist in strategic planning, to identify weak points in enemy movement, to guide younger marksmen who looked at her with trembling admiration. She complied without question, though each meeting left her feeling as if she were drifting further from the girl she used to be, stepping deeper into a version of herself she did not fully recognize. One night, after a successful defense that pushed back a major German advance, She found herself alone at the edge of a forest, lit faintly by the glow of distant fires. The trees cast long, skeletal shadows across the snow, and the air carried the bitter sting of smoke and the faint iron scent of blood. She stood there, motionless, listening to the quiet crackle of burning timber, the muffled cries of wounded soldiers being carried back to camp. For a moment she allowed herself to soften, to feel the enormity of what she had become part of. She wondered whether the world would remember any of them, whether the earth beneath her would absorb the echoes of their suffering, or simply freeze over them until spring washed everything away. Her ledger of confirmed kills reached 50 by the end of that month. Though unofficial counts whispered a number far higher, she did not track them, nor did she wish to. She only knew that she had become the silent shield of her unit, the unseen line that enemy soldiers crossed at their peril. And yet, beneath this growing legend, she remained deeply human, aching with fatigue, haunted by faces she would never forget, yearning for the warmth of a life untouched by war. Her heart had not hardened, it had expanded, carrying the weight of every life she protected and every life she ended. The path ahead would demand even more from her, drawing her into battles that would test not just her skill, but her spirit, pushing her toward the threshold of the impossible. But for now she returned to camp with snow clinging to her coat, her breath fogging the air, her fingers numb and trembling with a fatigue she refused to acknowledge. Her comrades greeted her with silent nods, their eyes filled with a mingled gratitude and grief. She sat beside the fire, letting its warmth seep into her bones, and prepared herself for the next long stretch of darkness. March arrived not with the promise of thaw, but with a deeper, more punishing cold, the kind that seeped into bone and memory until even hope felt brittle beneath its weight. The front lines trembled with the anticipation of a renewed German push, a great heaving of steel and desperation that threatened to break through the exhausted Soviet defenses. She sensed it long before the reports confirmed it, feeling the tension coiled in the silence between the distant thuds of artillery, a silence so heavy it seemed to press her heartbeat into the frozen earth. Her comrades felt it too, that subtle shift in the air that preceded catastrophe, and they clung to her presence with the unspoken belief that where she stood, the world might hold together just long enough for them to breathe. Her commanders reassigned her to an advanced observation post nestled deep within the forest, a skeletal tower of frost-splintered wood rising above a ravine choked with ice. It was a lonely station, exposed to wind and the haunting stillness of the trees, but from its height she could see the terrain unfold like a vast wounded map. Each ridge, each hollow, each fractured line of barbed wire became part of the quiet architecture she had learned to read. She spent hours scanning the horizon, her breath crystallizing in the air, her fingers curled around the chilled stock of her rifle. The world below her was both desolate and alive, every patch of shadow a potential threat, every movement a ripple that demanded her attention. She had become the eye of her unit, the watcher in the winter canopy, and the forest seemed to echo her vigilance. The German assault arrived under a moonless sky, a broken wave of infantry moving with eerie coordination through the trees. She saw them before the sentries did, their silhouettes gliding through the darkness, their outlines indistinct yet unmistakable. She steadied her breath, allowing the familiar slight tilt of her aim to guide her as it always had. Her first shot struck the officer leading the formation, and the ripple of confusion that followed bought her precious second. She fired again and again, her rhythm unbroken, her body melting into the tower's shadows until she seemed less like a soldier and more like a force carved from the cold itself. The Germans faltered, regrouped, pressed on. She continued her silent work, shaping the battle from above, with a precision that no longer surprised her, but still frightened those who witnessed. By dawn, the attack had dissolved into chaos, the forest littered with abandoned equipment and hurried footprints of retreat. Her unit, battered but intact, understood that her vantage had made the difference, though she accepted their gratitude with the same quiet discomfort as always. She descended from the tower with legs shaking from cold and exhaustion, her breath rasping in her chest. Her tally had risen again, though she refused to let the numbers settle in her mind. To her, it was simply another night survived, another morning where her comrades' faces were still present in the fragile light. But the war had begun to notice her. Whispers crept through headquarters like thin tendrils of smoke, traveling through ranks and rooms where strategy was spoken in hushed tones. The higher officers summoned her more frequently now, studying her with an analytical gaze that made her skin tighten beneath her uniform. They asked her to recount engagements, to explain her methods, to describe in detail the instinct she could barely articulate. She answered with humility, Yet she felt the invisible expectations coiling around her, pulling her deeper into a role she had never sought. They needed her, not just as a soldier, but as a symbol, a figure that proved resilience could be chiseled from even the most unlikely sources. She understood this burden, even if she did not welcome it, and she carried it with the same steady determination she brought to her rifle. As the days passed, she found herself drifting further from the warmth of human conversation, retreating into a quiet landscape, within her mind where she could sort through the accumulating weight of her choices. Her comrades watched her with a growing tenderness, recognizing the isolation settling over her like another layer of frost. They invited her to share meals, saved a place for her by the fire, spoke to her with gentle humor, even when exhaustion hollowed their voices. She appreciated these gestures more deeply than she could express, yet the distance remained, a gulf carved by the knowledge that each night she might be the one to determine who lived and who did not. This responsibility pressed into her as heavily as the cold, leaving long shadows beneath her. One afternoon, after a particularly violent exchange of artillery fire, she ventured beyond the perimeter to scout a ravine suspected of sheltering enemy stragglers. Snow drifted in soft spirals from the sky, muffling the world into a hush so profound it made her heartbeat sound cavernous in her ear. She moved carefully, her body attuned to every sound, the groan of shifting ice, the creak of a distant tree bowing beneath its frozen burden, the faint crunch of snow, disturbed by something heavier than wind. She found them at the ravine's edge, 3 German soldiers, huddled behind a fallen log, wounded and disoriented. They did not see her approach. She raised her rifle out of instinct, then froze. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, she saw not enemies, but boys barely older than herself, their faces pale with fear, their breath trembling in the cold. Something inside her cracked with a soft, painful sound. She lowered her weapon. The war had taught her many brutal lessons, but in that moment, she remembered the fragile humanity buried beneath the uniform, the grief mirrored across invisible lines. She retreated silently, leaving them there, knowing her report would omit this encounter. It was a small defiance, a whisper against the relentless tide of violence, and it lingered in her chest like a fragile ember of the person she had once been. Her tally climbed nonetheless. The battles intensified, pushing her beyond exhaustion, shaping her into a figure both relied upon and quietly feared. Yet she remained grounded by her unwavering purpose to protect the lives entrusted to hold the line when the world threatened to fracture. And as March gave way to the first faint hints of spring, she understood with haunting clarity that the greatest trials still lay ahead, waiting to test not just her skill, but the fragile, flickering humanity she fought so fiercely to preserve. The war did not relent. It merely shifted its weight, pressing harder in places already crushed, reaching deeper into the marrow of those still standing. By April, the snow had begun to recede, revealing the broken earth beneath, a patchwork of churned soil, rusting casing, and unmarked graves that whispered their secrets to the wind. The thaw did not bring relief. It brought rot, the heavy scent of decay rising from the ground, a grim reminder that the season's renewal was built upon layers of the dead. She walked among these ruins with a quiet reverence, her boots sinking into the softening mud, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though she could will it to widen, to make room for something beyond this endless cycle of survival. Her legend had spread far beyond her unit now. In villages miles away, weary civilians spoke of her in hushed tones. The girl sniper, the one with the crooked stance and the cursed aim that somehow never missed. Newspapers printed her name, though often misspelled, wrapped in phrases like the ghost of the eastern woods and the huntress of winter. None of these titles belonged to her, yet she accepted them with the same resigned patience she applied to every burden the war laid upon her shoulders. She did not seek glory. She sought meaning, or at least endurance, the fragile thread that allowed her to continue when everything else had long since been stripped away. Her commanders, eager to exploit her notoriety, began assigning her to missions of surgical precision, targets chosen for their strategic value rather than their proximity to the front. Officers, engineers, machine gun crews, each selected to slow the German advance through calculated absence. She was delivered by night into unfamiliar territory, often alone, carrying little more than her rifle, a few cartridges, and the fierce, quiet conviction that she could make a difference. The isolation of these missions was both punishment and refuge. Alone beneath the vastness of a cold sky, she found a strange peace in the stillness between the trigger's pull and the echo's fade. She began to understand that her imperfect aim was not an error to correct, but an alignment with the world's own flawed symmetry, a dance between intention and chance, between control and surrender. Her kills multiplied quickly during those weeks, yet each one felt heavier than the last. The closer she crept to her targets, the more she saw. The family photographs tucked into jacket pockets, the trembling hands lighting cigarettes in the dark, the weariness in faces that looked too much like her own. The war had ceased to be a battle between nations. It had become an exchange of exhaustion, a communion of those who could no longer afford to feel. She wondered, sometimes, whether she had become a ghost herself, a wandering consequence, a vessel for the cold arithmetic of survival. The men in her unit still greeted her warmly when she returned, but she saw in their eyes a flicker of something she could not name: awe, fear, gratitude, perhaps all three interwoven. During one mission, near the outskirts of a ruined village, she found herself pinned in the upper floor of a collapsed barn. The Germans had discovered her position sooner than expected, and the night erupted in gunfire, tracer rounds cutting through the air like lines of fire drawn by invisible hands. The wood splintered around her, shards stinging her face as she crawled through the debris. She pressed herself against the cold floor, counting the rhythm of their shots, waiting for the silence that would betray their reload. When it came, she rose slowly, aligning her crooked sight through a gap in the wall. 3 figures moved among the rubble below, one shouting orders, another searching for her shadow. She exhaled, steadying the tremor in her hands, and fired, once, twice. The echo rolled through the night like distant thunder, then faded into the sound of retreating boots. When the world fell quiet again, she remained still for a long while, her cheek pressed against the stock of her rifle, her heart thudding like the memory of a drum. She felt neither triumph nor relief, only the vast emptiness that followed survival. The barn smelled of dust, oil, and smoke. The stars outside burned cold and indifferent. Somewhere far behind her, the front lines shifted again, and she wondered if any of it would ever truly end. By the end of that month, her official count stood at 92 confirmed kills. Her superiors praised her in dispatches, elevating her to a symbol of endurance and skill, yet none of them saw the quiet grief accumulating in her eyes. Each number they recorded represented a heartbeat that no longer existed, and she carried them all with her, unburied, unforgotten. Her comrades treated her with a kind of reverent distance, uncertain whether to approach or simply watch her pass, like a living omen. Some whispered that she was protected by fate. Others believed she had given up her soul to the cold. The turning point came on a day without sunlight. A thick fog rolled in from the river, swallowing the camp in a veil of pale grey. She took her position at the edge of a ravine, where the enemy had been attempting to cross under cover of mist. The air was damp and heavy, muffling sound and distance alike. She waited for hours, her vision reduced to shifting silhouettes in the vapour. Then, through the haze, she saw them, 3 figures crawling across the plank bridge, their outlines faint but distinct. She took her first shot. The crack of the rifle was swallowed almost instantly by the fog. The figures froze, then scattered, one dropping into the ravine below. Another shot, another body vanished into the mist. The third ran, stumbling through the reeds until her final bullet silenced. When the fog finally lifted, she descended to confirm what she already knew. Her rifle hung heavy in her hands as she looked down into the ravine. The bodies lay where they had fallen, half submerged in the muddy water, faces turned toward the fading sky. She felt a strange stillness in that moment, not peace, not victory, but the quiet acknowledgement of what she had become. 95, 96, 97. The numbers whispered through her like prayer beads, each one both a burden and an absolution. In the days that followed, she fought through exhaustion that felt nearly holy in its intensity. Her unit was reassigned to a battered sector near Smolensk, where the land was scarred with the ghosts of battles past. She knew then that she was nearing the end of something, not the war itself, but the strange alchemy that kept her spirit intact. Still, she pressed on, because there was no other choice. Her comrades depended on her. The line had to hold. By early May, her count surpassed 100. She learned this not from her own records, but from the stunned silence that followed her commander's announcement, the flicker of disbelief that crossed even the most hardened faces. She had done what no one thought possible. Yet she felt only an ache in her chest and the faint tremor of her fingers as she cleaned her weapon one last time before dusk. 102 confirmed, 2 months, a number that would outlive her name. The spring thaw had transformed the front into a vast sea of mud, swallowing boots, bones, and memories with equal hunger. The snow that once masked the brutality of war had melted into rivers of filth that carried fragments of the past downstream. spent casings, torn cloth, broken helmets, each relic drifting towards some unseen ocean of oblivion. She stood amidst it all, her uniform damp and stained, her face thinner than before, eyes darker, quieter. The air smelled of thawed decay and burnt oil, a mixture so thick it clung to the back of the throat like grief. Yet through that haze of ruin, she moved with the same deliberate grace that had once drawn mockery from her comrade, a crooked silhouette, walking through the aftermath of her own endurance. The war was changing around her. New faces replaced the ones she had buried in memory. Young recruits with trembling hands and eyes still full of untested courage arrived daily, speaking her name as if it were a talisman. Some sought her mentorship, others merely to glimpse the woman whose lopsided aim had become legend. She accepted their presence with a kind of maternal patience, showing them how to breathe through the weight of the trigger, how to let the rifle become an extension of their heartbeat, how to listen to the wind, to the silence, to themselves. Yet she never spoke of the cost. She let them believe skill was born from talent rather than from loss. The truth was too heavy to pass along. Her reputation had reached the ears of the higher command. They summoned her to headquarters far from the front, where officers in clean uniforms studied her with the sterile fascination of scientists examining a rare specimen. They asked her to pose for photographs, to give statements for the papers, to smile. But she did not know how to smile anymore. The camera's flash startled like distant artillery, and she found herself blinking at the polished floor, as if the reflection of her own boots might explain how she had become something so far removed from the girl who once struggled to steady her uneven aim in the snow. The generals praised her, but their words fell flat against the memory of voices that no longer existed, the laughter of comrades, the whispers of those who had doubted her, the silence of those she would never see again. When they offered her leave, precious weeks away from the front, she hesitated. The idea of rest felt alien, almost dangerous, as if to stop moving might allow the weight of everything she had endured to finally crush her. Still, she accepted, traveling back through the scarred countryside toward a small town barely clinging to life. There she found a quiet room above a bakery, its walls thin enough for the scent of bread to slip through and remind her, faintly, of what ordinary life might have felt like. She slept for days, her dreams filled with faces half buried in snow, voices calling her from across an endless field. She woke often with her hands clenched around nothing, her breath ragged, her heart pounding to the rhythm of phantom gunfire. It was during those nights of restless reprieve that she realized something unspoken. The war had not merely taken her innocence, it had replaced it with an intimacy she could never escape. She knew death too closely now, not as an abstract horror, but as a companion she had learned to recognize by the tremor in the air, the sudden hush, the shot. Her crooked aim had become her identity, the strange imperfection through which she had survived, but survival had turned her into something half-living. She understood then that war did not end when the shooting stopped. It lingered in the spaces between silence, in the way the world seemed too still, too kind, too fragile. She returned to the front, despite protests from her superiors. They wanted her to remain a symbol, a poster figure for morale. But she refused to be turned into legend, while others still bled. She belonged to the cold earth and the endless watch, to the sound of her own breath in the stillness before dawn. When she stepped back into her trench, her comrades greeted her not with cheers, but with the soft, reverent nods of those who had missed a ghost. She took her place once more along the line, lying in the mud beside soldiers who were barely more than boys, her rifle steady, her crooked sight glinting in the half-light. The war had moved westward, but it was far from over. She could feel it humming beneath the soil, an unfinished song. In those final weeks, her shots grew rarer, not from weakness, but from choice. She had come to understand that killing, once necessity, had begun to feel like a language she no longer wished to speak. She fired only when she must, when the line trembled, when her comrades faltered, when silence itself demanded action, and still, her aim remained true, as if the world itself bent slightly in her favor, acknowledging the strange equilibrium between her imperfection and her precision. The men beside her no longer questioned her methods. They simply listened when she said, "Wait," or "now," their survival anchored to her intuition. One evening, as dusk bled across the horizon and the smell of rain mingled with the stench of war, she sat alone at the edge of a crater, cleaning her rifle. Her reflection shimmered faintly in a puddle of dark water, and she barely recognized the face staring back. The girl, who had once been mocked for her uneven aim, had vanished, leaving behind a woman shaped by the silence between shots, Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the accumulated weight of everything she had carried. She thought of the ones she had saved, the ones she had lost, the ones she had never known. Her chest tightened, and she realized she had forgotten how to cry. The sky darkened, and the distant rumble of artillery rolled like thunder across the plains. She rose, slinging her rifle over her shoulder, her crooked stance as steady as ever. She walked back toward her unit through the gathering rain, her boots sinking into the mud, her silhouette dissolving into the storm. The war was still calling, and she would answer, not as a hero, not as a legend, but as a soldier who had learned to see beauty in imperfection and strength in silence. The war's final weeks were a strange mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, a twilight suspended between despair and deliverance. The snow had long since melted, leaving behind a scarred landscape littered with the remnants of everything that had once been alive. The air smelled of damp soil and ashes, and the sky seemed perpetually veiled by a pale, reluctant light, as though even the sun hesitated to return fully to a world that had forgotten warmth. She walked through the ruins in silence, her rifle slung low, her steps heavy but measured. Each village they passed through was another ghost of civilization. Collapsed roofs, shattered glass, a child's doll half buried in mud, its porcelain face cracked but still faintly smiling. There were no cheers, no victory songs, only the quiet shuffle of soldiers too tired to celebrate and too haunted to weep. Her unit had dwindled to a handful of survivors. Those who remained looked to her with a strange mixture of reverence and sorrow, understanding that they were nearing the end not only of the war, but of something unnameable that had bound them together. They no longer spoke of her kills, no longer tallied the impossible number she had reached. The count had stopped mattering. The war had become a memory being written even as it ended. She moved among them like a presence beyond rank, her crooked aim now a symbol whispered among soldiers who believed, perhaps rightly, that perfection was less important than persistence. The final engagement came without fanfare, a scattered skirmish along the edge of a ravine where the enemy, already retreating, made one last desperate attempt to hold ground. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and wet earth. She took her position in the high grass, the barrel of her rifle glinting faintly in the mist. Her breath came steady, her body aligned with the uneven rhythm she had trusted since the beginning. When she fired, the shot curved ever so slightly, as it always had, finding its mark with quiet inevitability. Around her, the chaos swelled and then receded like the tide. The Germans withdrew, their shapes dissolving into the tree line. When the silence returned, it carried with it a strange finality, an echo that seemed to stretch beyond the battlefield, beyond even memory itself. Later, as dusk fell and the sound of distant engines announced the enemy's retreat, she lowered her rifle and simply stared at her hands. They trembled, not from fatigue, but from the sudden absence of purpose. The war had consumed her completely, and now, in the stillness that followed, she felt hollowed out, like the empty shell of a bullet once filled with fire. Her comrades gathered nearby, their faces lit by the soft, flickering glow of a campfire. Someone offered her a cup of water. She nodded, accepted it, drank slowly. The warmth of the fire reached her face, but it could not reach the depths of her bones. She thought of all she had seen, of the snow, the fog, the cries swallowed by wind, and she realized that the true battlefield had always been within her. When news of the German surrender finally arrived, it spread through the ranks with disbelief rather than joy. The men stared at one another as if waiting for the world to resume its breath. She felt nothing, no triumph, no relief, only the vast silence of an ending too immense to comprehend. That night, she walked alone beyond the perimeter, her boots sinking into the damp soil, the sound of the river carrying faint echoes of celebration from the distant camps. She sat beneath a birch tree stripped bare by artillery, her rifle across her knees, and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to remember the beginning, the laughter of the men who had mocked her, the sting of humiliation, the determination that had burned quietly beneath it. She smiled then, faintly, not in pride, but in gratitude, for the crooked aim that had once been her flaw and had become her salvation. Years later, when peace had hardened into memory and the world began to rebuild itself, her story lived on in fragments. Children learned her name in schoolbooks, though few could pronounce it correctly. Her photograph, taken reluctantly near the end of the war, hung in museums, her face pale and unreadable, her rifle slanted across her shoulder like a question. Historians argued over the exact number, whether it was truly 102, or more or less. But the number no longer mattered. What endured was the quiet defiance of her story, the reminder that courage often wears an imperfect shape. In her later years, she returned often to the countryside where the war had once swallowed her youth. The forests had grown back, swallowing the scars of trenches and barbed wire. She would walk among the birch trees in spring, the air rich with the scent of new leaves, and pause sometimes to listen, to the wind, to the rustle of unseen wings, to the silence that had once been filled with screams. She had learned to live with ghosts, to speak gently to the memories that refused to fade. And though she never fired another shot, she still carried her rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth by time and by hands that had long ago stopped trembling. Those who met her in her final years described her as quiet but fierce-eyed, a woman who seemed to see both past and present in the same glance. When she spoke of the war, it was without bitterness. They laughed, she once said softly, but they didn't understand. Sometimes what looks crooked is the only thing that stands straight in. And when she died, long after the guns had fallen silent, they buried her beneath a birch tree on the edge of the forest where she had once waited, patient and unseen. Her rifle lay beside her, its barrel tilted slightly, forever imperfect, forever true. Her name carved into stone, her story whispered by the wind. If you enjoyed this story of courage and imperfection, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories of forgotten heroes who shaped history in silence.